Welcome to our In Focus discussion tonight. Tonight, it's about monopolies, businesses that have grown to enormous size and wield enormous power. Utah Attorney General Sean Reyes spearheaded a lawsuit against Google and will join us later to talk about it. But first, we wanted to give you a historical perspective. Earlier, we interviewed Matt Stoller, the research director of the American Economic Liberties Project and author of Goliath, the 100-Year War Between Monopoly Power and Democracy. We started the interview by asking about the businesses of the 1900s.
That was an era that is commonly referred to today as the Gilded Age, and that was the formation of what we would today understand as corporate America. So what happened is from about the 1880s until about 1912 or so, there was a vigorous debate about what do we do in a democracy when you have these really large concentrations of capital and political and economic power. And over the course of those 25 years or so, we developed a system that included some regulation. It included antitrust law, broke up some of those companies and said, we're going to have big business, but it's not going to be too big. And we're going to make sure that there's competition so those firms are not dominant in any particular market. So that's how we ultimately tamed that first generation of robber barons. And I hope that's how people learn about that era.
Now, what did monopolies do to workers of that era? What was it like to work in steel or for a railroad at the time?
It's a great question. So, it depends where you were. It depends what industry you were in. So out west, it was pretty bad. There was often violence in mines, and the capital was controlled by people in the east, largely New York or Ohio, the kind of upper Midwest as well, some Pittsburgh, and so the rest of the country, in everywhere from Montana to Utah to Alabama, what you had was a kind of colonial relationship with the eastern centers of capital. And the net effect of that is that workers could be, they could be paid well and treated well, but often they weren't. And this was particularly true in things like the mining industry, but also, manufacturing, steel making, aluminum.
How much control did monopolies have over day-to-day life, and how was it different from the power of government?
So, one way to understand the problem of monopoly, and this is something I go into in Goliath, is that monopoly power is actually a system of governance. So when Mark Zuckerberg, for example, he has said that, and this is a quote, in many ways, Facebook is more like a government than a business. What we're really doing is setting policies. And that's largely true. When you have power in a market, you are setting the prices, the terms and conditions over that entire market. And that makes you more like a sovereign entity than it does a kind of a competitive business. You are structuring that market. And that's how it was back in the 1880s, 1890s, early 1900s. If you were in the oil industry, then the boss was John D. Rockefeller. He was the guy who told you what you could drill, what price you were paid, how you had to structure your business. And maybe you worked for Standard Oil, but maybe you had your own company. But either way, that was the guy who was in charge because he controlled the pipelines and the railroads that you had to move the oil through, and ultimately the refining choke point. And that was true across the board in a host of different industries. And so what was happening is it was a kind of challenge to a liberal democracy or a republic, because all of a sudden, in the political sphere, white men in particular were free, but so there were other social issues that were problematic. But in terms of citizens who could vote, they were free in a political sense, but then in the economic sense, they were very unfree. When the stock market crashed, because there was too much speculation and too much of a concentration of power in too few hands, then it led to the Great Depression. And the Great Depression was explicitly this is the Pecora Commission, which was a commission by the Senate Banking Committee run by an investigator named Ferdinand Pecora. he went into depth into the roots of the Depression. And I think one of the things that he found is that a lot of the bad practices that were going on Wall Street by the JP Morgans of the world, although there were many others who were involved, that had led to a collapse of the economy. It was very similar to what happened in 2008.
Could you talk a little bit about Mariner Eccles, who is well known in Utah, played a part in this story? Could you talk about his contribution?
Yeah, so Mariner Eccles was he was a Scottish family, became a Mormon, and they had kind of ran an industrial and banking group in Utah. And he was, a very kind of credible banker. And when the whole system collapsed, he was one of the few people who came out and said, we need the government to take a lot more responsibility for swings in the economy. We need the government when we're in a depression. We need the government to spend, and we need the government to be more aggressive in terms of its monetary policy. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt, at the time, the New Dealers were trying to figure out what to do about this collapsed economy, and nobody had any good ideas. And anytime you would attempt to do something, there was this, a lot of business leaders would say, oh, that's like communism or socialism or whatever. And then here was this banker, Mariner Eccles, say, no, we need the government to spend more to boost the economy. We need the government to do more in terms of monetary policy. And so he came to the attention of FDR, who eventually put him in charge of the Federal Reserve. And he basically reshaped the way that we manage the economy in the United States. And there were actually a bunch of bankers that were incredibly angry at Mariner Eccles for doing this. What Mariner Eccles was doing was helping to restructure the economy so that we could actually build a defense base to eventually fight in World War II, and ensure that the democratic way of life could continue.
Coming up, we continue our conversation with Matt Stoller about the modern day monopolies and the influence they have over our lives. We'll be right back in just 2.5 minutes. Welcome back to our second In Focus discussion on monopolies and antitrust lawsuits. We pick up now right where we left off with author Matt Stoller. Now let's talk about the current landscape. What does economic commerce look like now? How do big companies like Walmart, Citibank, and big tech affect our day-to-day lives? And why should we be thinking about this at all?
It's a good question. I mean, there's this we think about politics as a kind of set of social questions that might deal with, flag burning or abortion or whatever else you want to, you talk about, which are important questions. But there's a whole other area of politics, which is the liberty of the marketplace. And, how you buy things, how you sell things, how you sell your labor, whether you can start a business, how we trade ideas and crops and goods, how we move things, all of that part of who we are as a people and as communities. And a lot of our social infrastructure is embedded in our businesses. A town with a factory, looks very different after that factory gets offshored. And a town that has a thriving main street with a bunch of retail businesses looks very different than a town that, doesn't have any of them because a Walmart opened up 20 miles away.
There have been several economic crises due to this return to concentrated power, like the savings and loan scandal in the 80s and the housing market crash of the early 2000s. Lots of ordinary people lost a lot. What was the government's reaction to all of this?
Yeah, so both times the government actually helped cause the crisis in some ways by changing policy and allowing for consolidation of banking power. The 2008 crisis was caused by the repeal of Glass-Steagall. It was caused by the non-enforcement of certain financial regulations. So then because of that, you had this giant crash, which you had during the savings and loan crisis as well, but this one was much bigger. And then the government bailed out those large financial services firms, and instead of wiping them out and wiping out the executives. And so I think you've seen a real political reaction every time. The political reaction gets worse. People lose faith in government. They lose faith in our business institutions. They lose faith in our cultural institutions. And so the government had a huge role. But it's not just the government, right? The government is us. We elected this government. It was our political leaders And it was also Wall Street that was lobbying for a lot of the things that turned out very badly.
What do you make of the recent antitrust lawsuits against big tech? And do you think there is an appetite for change now?
Yeah, so there are 4 antitrust suits against Google for monopolization. There is 1 suit against Amazon from the DC District Attorney, the DC Attorney General. There are several suits against Facebook. I'm not sure there's any government suit against Apple, but there are private suits against Apple. What you're seeing is, a political pushback against the dominance of these 4 firms who are each worth, I think, more than $1 trillion and are enormously powerful. There is consolidation across the economy and everything from cable to airlines to mail sorting software, but big tech, I think, is those are the pace setters of the economy. So the attention, the monopolization and frustration that people have towards that monopolization, I think a lot of the political the political focus has been on those 4 firms, and big tech is now facing scrutiny over their various mergers and monopolistic practices.
Final question for you. What concerns you the most now, and what do you have hope for in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're gonna win this fight. There is so much anger. We talk to farmers and ranchers and pharmacists and artists and people from across the spectrum, and they all have a problem, which is that they can't get access to markets because the markets are dominated by a small number of firms that engage in kickbacks and various coercive practices. And everyone's mad that pharmaceutical prices are so high, and they really shouldn't be as high as they are. And that's true with cable. It's true with a bunch of other areas. And then, I think Republicans in particular are upset with big tech, but Democrats aren't far behind. It's just crazy that we let Mark Zuckerberg structure how we talk to one another and how our politics works, and ultimately that's not sustainable. So I think we are going to win. I would say that, and I say we, I think it's a sort of a bipartisan coalition that's trying to reduce concentrations of power. I worry about a lot of things, but I think the biggest obstacle right now is the courts. The judges tend to read the law very narrowly. A lot of antitrust, defense lawyers are operate, in somewhat bad faith and have gotten used to violating the law or encouraging their clients to violate the law. And, judges are, they are generally very deferential to corporate power. They weren't always, but now they are. And so that's a huge problem. We're going to have to figure out how to get around that. We're probably going to have to write new statutes. Hopefully, states are going to do it. I know that Wyoming just passed a new antitrust law. New York is starting to go in that direction. Their state senate took up some antitrust action. Hopefully, Utah will do it as well. But that's the main challenge right now is the judges are saying we don't want to accept these new cases against dominant market power.
Such an interesting conversation. Thank you so much. You've been hearing from Matt Stoller, the Director of Research at the American Economic Liberties Project and author of the book, Goliath, the 100-Year War Between Monopoly Power and Democracy. Matt, thank you so much for your time tonight. We appreciate you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me.
Up next, we continue our discussion on monopolies and antitrust lawsuits with Utah Attorney General Sean Reyes about a lawsuit he's leading against Google and why. We'll be right back in just 2.5 minutes. Welcome to our third and final In Focus discussion tonight on monopolies and antitrust lawsuits. Rounding out our conversation tonight is Utah Attorney General Sean Reyes. And AG, glad to have you here tonight. Sorry about the loud rain, but we look forward to this discussion with you tonight. Now, before we get into the lawsuit about Google, let's talk about the opioid settlement. You talked about this with media today. In your view, was the opioid crisis in any part a result of monopolistic practices of the pharmaceutical industry?
Rosie, it's great to be with you. Today we announced a historic, a very important agreement, a precursor to a full settlement. I think it's a very good thing for the state of Utah, especially those families that have suffered so long and need immediate relief from the opioid epidemic. To your question about whether we were concerned about anti-competitive behavior, in this lawsuit, it was less that. There might have been some of that because you're talking about some very big and powerful actors in pharma. But for us, the focus was less on anti-competitive behavior and more of a conspiracy across manufacturers, distributors, and other actors to basically sell a lie to the American public that opioids were not nearly as addictive as they are, and we lost an entire generation, so many thousands and thousands of Utahns to death by opioid overdose, and so many are still fighting the disease of addiction and are in the cycle of addiction. This settlement or agreement, which will hopefully soon be a final settlement, will bring billions of dollars to Americans all over our nation and hundreds of millions of dollars to Utahns to prevent the next generation from getting addicted and to take care of those right now who need recovery, who need therapy. So again, important case, not really focused on the same issues and types of things that we're looking at in the Google case.
Thanks for letting us sneak that question in. So
Sure.
Then let's talk about now the lawsuit against Google. What prompted you to start it, and what were the issues that you saw there?
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't know if this rain has anything to do with it. This is like deluge. I thought maybe it was a sign, or maybe Google somehow controlling the weather also in its hyper dominance of the marketplace. Personally, I come at this, Rosie, because I come from the tech sector. For many years, I represented tech companies as an outside lawyer, and then I was in-house counsel and general counsel for a tech company. I've invested in tech companies and helped run tech companies, and I'm so proud of Utah. I'm proud of all of the innovation, Silicon Slopes and so many others in Utah. But to stay competitive and to keep a level playing field, Google is such a hyper-dominant player in the market. And how we define the market in the Google environment, which is Android, they are the only player, effectively a one-entity monopoly. And they've been leveraging their power in ways that have really made it hard for the next Google to rise up and challenge them and provide real competition. And just like the Economist said prior leading in, I mean, truly, Americans and Utahns are benefited when there is real competition for products and services. So for us, this lawsuit represents a number of years of investigation, bipartisan collaborative work to stand up for the little guys, to stand up for small businesses across Utah and America and say enough's enough. You can't have Google take their gigantic leverage and power and cram it down on these small businesses. It doesn't help the competitors, and it certainly doesn't help consumers here in Utah.
Thank you for that. AG, while you are focusing on Google, how are you thinking about other monopolistic companies inside and outside of tech?
Sure, there are other industries. We are active. Utah punches above its weight. We have incredible lawyers and legal professionals in the state, and we've helped take the lead on a number of other cases outside of the tech sector when it comes to anti-competitive behavior, and we'll continue to do that. So it's not just about targeting tech, it's not just about focusing on big tech. Google and other big tech players are allowed to make a profit, they're allowed to innovate. We want them to do that. They just need to do that within the bounds and the rules of the law, and they need to do that in a way that fosters true competition in the marketplace.
AG, we have some time for final thoughts. As Utahns are thinking about this topic tonight and maybe your lawsuit, what do you want to leave them with?
You know, I want to leave them with some hope, and I think this is a very exciting time for small businesses, again, in Utah. Coming out of COVID, Utah is leading the way in so many technology markets. And the more interconnectedness that we have, whether it's Internet of Things, blockchain, all of these different ways that technology influences our lives, we have to make sure that Utahns and Utah companies and businesses and consumers have a way to truly compete and get the products and services that they deserve without actions like Google is taking. So we're standing up, we're sending a message to Google, and hopefully the people of Utah are listening and understand that we're doing it for them.
You've been hearing from Utah Attorney General Sean Reyes. And Attorney General, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Stay dry in the rain.
I'll try. Thanks, Rosie.
And don't forget, we'd love to hear from you about the show. We invite you to join our Facebook group by going to facebook.com/group/ABC4 In Focus, or send us an email, infocus@abc4.com.